I'm sick and tired of establishment politics, and they
Welcome to
want
New Libs on the
real
Block.
change.
I am Andy Smith,
And I'm Breon Curran.
and we are lucky to have our returning guest slash co-host representative Kim Hicks from District 25A in the great city of Rochester, Minnesota, and some other places around Rochester, Minnesota. Kim, welcome back to the podcast.
Welcome back, Kim Hicks.
So good to see you both.
So good to have you. So a couple weeks ago, I guess almost a month ago now, we had you for a excellent episode talking very broadly about disability rights and the state of them, and particularly how the Trump administration is attacking those hard-earned rights. And it was such a great conversation that we didn't actually get to what we had asked you on to talk about, which is the broader human services budget and what's happening in Minnesota and federally and why costs are escalating there. So we are so happy to have you back. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I'm excited to be back. I'm excited to talk about my favorite thing in the whole world, which is people with disabilities.
Yes.
But before that, I thought we should talk about what is happening in the U.S. Senate, and literally just ended as we are recording tonight on Tuesday night, which is Senator Cory Booker's filibuster speech that went over 24 hours, is the longest in U.S. history, where he stood up and berated both President Trump and his administration, but also his fellow senators and fellow members of Congress for not stepping up for their duties as the holders of the purse, people who do checks on oversteps of executive power, a whole lot of things. It was absolutely incredible. The three of us have some experience in filibusters, not ourselves. We've never had to talk in a filibuster. We were on the other side. Thankfully, we've never heard a 24-hour speech before, but I wanted to know, have either of you guys been following that or watched Senator Booker's any part of his filibuster this week?
I have not watched his filibuster, but to your point, Andy, last session when we had the filiburger, as we call it, conversations went to great lengths for hours and hours about the finest burgers that Minnesota restaurants and other shops have to offer. And, disappointingly, we did not get to talk about our favorite burger joints, perhaps another day when we need to use a filiburger ourselves.
Kim, did you watch any of the Senator Booker filibuster?
Well, I've been in committee meetings all day, and so I haven't been able to watch any of the live feed, but I have been following some of the, social media pieces about it. I think for me, the idea that we have some tools in our toolbox, right? But the Republicans control the House, they control the Senate, and they control the executive branch on the national level, which means our tools are limited. But we should be using every tool in our toolbox. And I think today, Senator Booker demonstrated that you can pull out some tools, try some stuff, right? And stand up for what's right and stand up for what you believe and share all of that all the time. And I'm really excited to read the whole recap.
I found out that my hotel room up here in St. Paul does have C-SPAN 2, which is the live feed from the Senate floor. So I just had it on in the background because I had some office hours this afternoon where I was working on other stuff. And the incredible thing is all of us have spoken on the floor of a legislative body before. Time moves very slowly, actually, when you're talking. And to think about talking for that long is, A, just astounding to think of. B, being even just the recipient of a filibuster that didn't really mean anything. This one really, I think, really means something, but a filibuster just to like delay, where they were literally just like talking about McDonald's for 45 minutes, like members of the floor would do that, or Hardee's or whatever they were talking about. It's exhausting. Like, it really like gets to you. And so remembering that experience that I had from my legislative experience, and then Senator Cory Booker literally at like hour 18 telling coherent stories about the one that I really like tuned into was he was talking about his own father struggling with Alzheimer's and a personal experience he had in a bathroom actually changing his own father, which I didn't even think about this, that Rep. Hicks is on here. You made a bill to make sure that we had adult changing tables in public restrooms in 2023. But he's telling this incredibly strong and powerful story about how important it is to fund research around this. in hour 19, and it's incredibly powerful. And I hope every Democrat in Washington D.C. like really takes this to heart. That we do have tools, as Kim said, to push back and push back strong. And people were so galvanized by this. Like my constituents, people were texting me. My sister-in-law accidentally donated to Cory Booker through my Act Blue account because it was just the last one that was on the computer that we use at the house. So like stuff is happening, which is so exciting. And I think if every Democrat, even half Democrats, had this much fire and pushback, we would have a much more coherent opposition party and voice against the Trump administration in DC.
Yeah, I agree. And, we at the onset of the election, I think what most of us feared and what had started happening as soon as Trump took office is we saw people sort of pre-comply and just sort of give in, like the environment's different, we're just giving up. And there were some votes that were taken a couple months ago by even some of our Minnesota Democrats that are in the federal government that weren't great and are really, really difficult to defend, especially then when we see someone like Booker stand up and just talk for over 24 hours. I mean, that's the kind of leadership, that's the kind of pushback that we need to see. So I'm really glad we're seeing that.
Something that I have thought about as the Cory thing and some of the other kind of leadership conversations in the party, and you brought up something that triggered that for me, Brianne, is like when we talk about leadership, I think there are people who are really good at leading when they're in power, and that's important, right? But I also think that there are people who are really good at leading when you have less power and who can recognize how to lead in the minority. And it's a different skill set. Leading in the minority is a different skill set than leading in the majority, right? And I think what we're seeing is that Senator Booker can lead in a minority. And I think that, those are conversations that we should be, I mean, we don't have to have them. We don't have to choose those things, right? But I think it's stuff that we should point out to people. That is a different skill set, right? When you're leading in the majority, you are leading for consensus. You are leading to get a deal. You are leading to find a solution, right? When you're leading in the minority, you're leading to identify what's wrong with the deal. You're leading to identify what's not working for people. You're leading to make sure you don't leave anyone behind, even if you can't change who ends up behind, right? You're leading from the place of highlighting that. And I think that's what he did today. He highlighted all of those fears. He highlighted all of those concerns. He highlighted all of those reasons, right? And that is something that I think in this moment we need. We need people who can lead in this space, that moment in time, which is different from leading in a majority. It's different than where they currently are, where, the Republicans have the executive branch, the Senate, and the House.
And I think you're totally right, Kim, when you say that. And I'd even go a step farther and being like, what you described is great, like in the best of times, like when the opposition party is a responsible opposition party and you just need that leadership to highlight the differences and why you think your position is important. And it's even more important now when I think we would all agree that the other side is not just having different policy decisions than we would have, but is like actively breaking our Constitution and our laws and overstepping. And folks who should be backstops to that, not in a policy sense, but in an actual just, I would say, like patriotic sense or understanding of our systems, are not doing it. So it is always important to have that voice, and even more important now. And that's why it's been so painful that lack has been there for like months. And hopefully this is sort of a first, groundswell there. I should say people are doing that, like AOC and Bernie Sanders, like Stop the Oligarchs tour. That stuff is great. Jasmine Crockett is doing great, but like we need more people. So I'm glad Senator Booker has now joined the party. It's great. If you haven't checked out some coverage on it, I would recommend looking stuff on it. But without further ado, let's transition to Human Services. So last week, as we were recording this on Tuesday, April 1st, we received what's called budget targets, which are for each committee in the House as well as in the Senate. We get a specific budget of how much money there is to spend, or not to spend depending on the year, how to plan things out, and that really dictates what kind of legislation we can pass, because almost all legislation, I think people don't realize this, there's no reason to, I don't even think I realized this until I was in here. Basically, every piece of legislation has some kind of cost, whether it's administrative, whether it is something that the departments have to do, or new positions that are required. Like, everything usually has a cost. So what we do in a budget really dictates how we can go forward. And in these budget targets, it was highlighted something that we've already known for a long time, which is that the cost of human services committee priorities are getting more and more expensive. And so when cuts are being talked about to services at the federal level, especially, but also certainly at our state level, those are normally the discussions that are around it, which is why the targets for the Human Services Committee is to cut $300 million for this biennium, and then in the tails later on, over $1 billion. So this is why we really wanted to have, Brianna, you are very knowledgeable on this as well, but Kim Hicks to talk about this space with us. And so listeners know, I'm going to be asking a lot of questions and not talking a lot, because this is not my space, and we're so glad to have it. So let's start out with a big overarching question. Kim, before we even get to these budget targets, let's just talk about the human services space. Why are we seeing such a balloon in cost in this area?
So there's a couple of reasons. And I want you all to like go on a little journey with me back to 2010. I was pregnant with my son, and I was sitting at the Odyssey Conference, which is a yearly disability and aging conference that used to happen all the time. And I was sitting at the Odyssey Conference, and I was listening to a speaker talk about the workforce shortage and the silver tsunami that was to come. And this keynote speaker was talking about it. And they were talking about sometime between 2020 and 2023, we were going to see a bunch of boomers retire, and we were not going to have the workforce to care for them. And they talked about how that was going to be difficult. But they talked about how that was going to be the prelude to the actual crisis, and that the actual crisis is coming in 2030, 2035, maybe 2040, kind of depending on how you cut it. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The big one is people are retiring and they are aging, and disability is the great equalizer. It's not if you will get a disability, it's when. If you live long enough, you will get a disability. Now, whether or not it's one that is super impactful for your activities of daily living remains to be seen, but everybody will be touched by disability, right? And so we have all these people retiring, and that is absolutely changing the landscape as far as workforce shortage. So that's a bit of a problem. It's a big problem.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also this piece that we don't talk about. And I asked in committee, and the department answered. There's a whole lot of people who are people with disabilities who have always had disabilities, or have had them since they were children, or since they were 20, or since they were 30, right? Who are now living into their 60s and 70s. And those people are already on disability service waivers. They're on a CADI waiver. They're on a DD waiver. Over 24% of the people on CADI and DD waivers are over the age of 65. That is new. That is new. And the reason that that's new is because they didn't live before. They died. They died. The average life expectancy for someone with a complex developmental disability you didn't used to live to be 60. This is exciting. Like, it's wonderful. But it's a real thing that's happening. 24%. And if you're already on one of those disability waivers, when you turn 65, you don't move over to an elderly waiver. You stay on a developmental disabilities waiver. So I want you to picture for a moment someone who has a developmental disability. And I'm just going to make this person up, but I'm going to model it after somebody I knew. Somebody who has a developmental disability. And this person is minimally verbal. They have some verbal. They use sign language to communicate. And they have had this developmental disability since birth. And they've been receiving services for a long time. Their intellectual functioning limits their activities of daily living. It makes them hard to do stuff for themselves. They need, constant supervision and support. And they've always had that support. And they started in our institutions. They lived in our Minnesota State Institution. And they were 25 when the last state institution started closing in the 90s. And subset, the last person was discharged from a Minnesota institution in 1997. So I just need everybody to I need people to understand how close we are to institutionalization, right? We're right here, right here. We're not even a whole generation. Like those people are in their 20s, right? The people who were born in 97 are in their 20s. So we're real new to not being institutionalized. So I want you to picture somebody who was in their 30s when deinstitutionalized. That person is now in their 50s or their 60s. I want you to think about someone who's always needed around the clock support, who struggles to communicate verbally, who uses sign language as their primary communication, who needs support with all of their ADLs. And then I want you to add on aging. I want you to think about what becoming older looks like and take all of those barriers and put them in somebody who's now 70, but who already had those things and is now 70. So now is losing their hearing. Maybe now they're losing their vision. They're stumbling more. They're struggling with their walking, right? Their cognition is slowed because they're aging, right? So they were already struggling with those things and now they're aging. 24% of people on our waivers, our disability waivers, are now over 60. That is significant in what that care looks like. I want you to think about what care looks like for a 75-year-old who had no disabilities before. And then take all of those additional person-specific needs and plop them into that. And what you have is a more expensive cost of care. On top of more and more elders who are needing care, which is expanding the elderly waiver, right? On top of more and more elders who saved for care or were lucky enough to get long-term care insurance before that became no longer a product anyone would buy, which I would like to circle back to if you'll let me. But so those folks are private paying in cash for the same services that that person we were just talking about needs with much more support, right? And so we're also competing for a workforce while also having less of a workforce. And like all of that is one side of the coin. That's the 65 and older side. And you'll hear a lot of people focus on that side. But the fastest growing developmental disability in the United States and in Minnesota, and frankly, kind of around most of the world where that tracks the data, is autism. So in Minnesota, it's like 2.8, 2.9% of 8-year-olds have autism. Almost 3%. To put that in context for you, that's more than we have Native Americans in Minnesota, percentage-wise. It's like, I want to put that into context. That's a huge subset of people who have autism. So those are the current 8-year-olds, but that data is 4 years old. So those 8-year-olds are now 12, okay? The years before that, we were at 1.8, 1.9, 2.2%. That cohort of people, they're all turning 18 now, and they're all trying to enter the workforce. They're all trying to move into independent living. They're all needing some supports. And autism is a spectrum. So not everybody needs supports at all. And some people need a lot of supports, and a lot of people are in the middle, right? And so that is, part of this conversation. And the other part of this conversation that we just do not talk about, because when we talk about human services, we talk about nursing homes, we talk about old people, right? We talk about people with disabilities. That's what we do. What we leave out of that conversation is mental health and substance use disorder. Mental health and substance use disorder also comes out of the human services budget. And since 2020, we have seen an incredible increase in severe and persistent mental health. We have seen an incredible increase in fentanyl overdoses and a huge opioid epidemic, right? We've also seen significant needs in housing and access to basic care because of the economic situation we're in. And when all of those things come together, all of that falls into human services, all of it. You can't only talk about elder care. You can't only talk about disability. You can't only talk about substance use. You can't because they're all connected. And so when you put all of those things, which all require a lot of support, which are all very expensive, in one bucket of the state budget and then go, I wonder that keeps going up because all the things in it are things that we are experiencing more in our humanity. And that's not a Minnesota thing. That's like a world thing.
And I think it's important to say, and I'm so glad you did this as you're talking about this, we have not talked about like politics at all, right? Like decisions either party has made to this point, but as you said, this experience of humanity, of like this good thing that we're living longer, that the most vulnerable around us are getting more care than they have for the most of the history of humanity, as well as we have more people than we have had before, are just things that we were always going to face. And then I'm sure we're going to get into choices we have made that make this perhaps not as prepared for this situation as we could have. But this was a situation that was coming, as you said. I've heard you tell that story before about 2010, knowing this is coming, and telling people like, why are we surprised this is coming? Breon, can you add some context around that as well? I saw you wanting to jump in.
I love hearing Kim Hicks talk human services, and I'm blessed to be able to do that most of the week. So it's great. And, I'll just chime in. Of course, everything that Kim is saying is absolutely true. We are taking better care of people in general. Advances, skills advance, we learn more things, we learn earlier interventions, whether we're talking about children or adults, for a variety of different things. And so all the research and all of these, good things that have happened in academia have lended to us providing better supports to people, and that's resulting in people living longer and fuller lives. And that does cost more money. Expanding in human services. To Kim's point too, one thing that some folks may or may not know, folks who have Down syndrome, for example, every person with Down syndrome develops Alzheimer's disease. Like this is a known thing. This is something that happens. And, if you know anything about Alzheimer's disease, you know that it does tend to shorten someone's life pretty significantly. And for somebody who has Down syndrome, in the past, we would see that decline. And unfortunately, someone would pass away in their 40s or so. And even that is something that just through time, through different therapies, through all of these different things, ways to keep people engaged, knowing that this is something people are going to deal with and going through some preventive measures to try to slow the process, people are living longer. Even though, we're not stopping the bad thing from happening, we're all going to go through, as Kim said, difficulties in life as we age, as we get older. The end of the story is the same for all of us, right? But the folks who are facing, the most difficult healthcare issues are, for the most part, living longer, and that is more expensive. And over time, wages increase. We have inflation. So, of course, all of those things that naturally happen in any other issue area that causes cost to rise, human services is certainly not immune to that. If anything, it has always been farther behind in funding. And that's why we see such a concern when it comes to the workforce shortage, is we're just not funding it well enough already to be able to pay people the wages they need that would also show the state and the government's prioritization of caring for people by making this, a solid, viable career path. We're still not doing that. We're still working from behind. So yeah, costs do continue to rise, but unless we have a way to, make everything cheaper all of a sudden, this is an issue that we'll continue facing in human services.
And on top of that, of course, we have rising costs from inflation, larger economic setbacks because of tariffs. The actual cost of all healthcare is going up. In the Commerce Committee, someone said this very well. It's just like, the cost of a bandage is increased almost twice what it was in 2015. So that's just going to make all care, a very basic, medical supply, more expensive. And on top of that, I will just for a moment get on a high horse and say our insurance industry in this country is completely wrong. It's not working. It's completely failing the people who are supposed to be insured by these insurance companies that are making trillions in profits and yet are causing people to not get the care that they want. So all of these things are conflating at a very, very tough moment already in the history of our country. So let's ask the really hard question. What are we doing as the state of Minnesota? What can we do, or how do we approach this with the also tough financial place our state is? So, Brianna, maybe this time I'll go to you first. You want to talk about what human services committees are being asked to do, what that looks like in your response to it, and then Kim will come to you.
Yeah, happy to jump in. It'll be no surprise for folks to know or hear that I'm very disappointed in budget targets in human services. And that's not just in the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate. My disappointment started with the governor's budget proposal. And I was worried that moving forward, the work in the legislature would be done to sort of back up and go along with the governor's budget proposal. And unfortunately, I think that's what we're seeing is there was human services, again, as Kim said, we cover a lot of different areas, but we're covering people. And I know I was thinking about recording our podcast today, Andy, and kind of going back to what we always center, what we try to center the podcast in is the capital T, capital P, the people. And I know Kim and I sitting on the Human Services Committee might be a little bit biased, but our committee is about people and their needs and how we meet them. Their most basic needs. And without meeting those most basic needs, we can't even have conversations about any of the other committee jurisdiction areas. Those are sort of the next in line as you move through life, the different things that we have to spend money on. Of course, there are costs to that. But if we can't even keep people surviving, if we can't provide the services that people need on a daily basis, this is a group of folks who are very, very vulnerable. Kim asked this question in part 1 of our podcast with her, is whose healthcare matters more? And that's exactly the kind of questions that we're having to grapple with as we try to come together or try to put a budget together with a projected, $1 billion cut in the tails. I again, very, very disappointed in the direction we're going. I don't know, how we avoid cuts other than raising revenue, which is a really, really unpopular thing to say on its face. But the truth of the matter is that caring for people is expensive. And we as a state and as a country have never done well enough at collecting what it takes to provide good services to people, to provide the services they need to live every single day. It just hasn't been prioritized. It's always been, every single year it's the surprise that, oh my gosh, you're asking for more money. Yeah, because you always say no, or if you don't say no, you make cuts. And then we came in the trifecta in 2022 in the 23-24 biennium, and we did have a little extra money, and we were able to put in some one-time funding, most of which in this landscape went to nursing homes, which again Kim had mentioned. The elderly population is a huge part of the conversation, but it's not the only part of the conversation. And so there are a massive amount of people who have continually been left behind in these conversations. So for me, both personally and politically, it's really difficult for me in good conscience to move forward with the idea that we'll have to be making cuts, period, but cuts to the tune of $1 billion. It hits me right in my heart. And frankly, I'm glad that I can have this conversation with you two today without getting really emotional, because the last few days I could not do so. So, I think with that, maybe we get a little more of Kim's perspective on what our funding looks like.
Tell us a little bit about the decisions that are forced upon us.
I have all of the same feelings as Brianne. I'm struggling. But I want to point out that we have built an entire industry on Medicaid welfare dollars. When we talk
And you
about
mean industry in a very technical, make money off of this, to be clear with folks.
Well, and I mean businesses, both for profit and nonprofit. But the thing that, I said I wanted to come back to long-term care insurance, because insurance companies got out of long-term care because they couldn't make money on it, because everybody needs long-term care and you couldn't pay enough premiums to ever make it work. right? There's not enough mass to make it make work, which is why these are public services, right? It's no coincidence that nursing homes are being bought up by equity companies. That's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that there are providers, disability providers, who run an organization and the owner of that organization owns all of the properties and the people living in the house pay rent to the owner through a different LLC. That's not a coincidence. It's a feature, not a bug, right? There's a reason that that folks who need services feel like they don't have choices, because the choices are being run by the people who provide the services. And many of them are great people. I love a lot of providers. I was a provider. Like, this isn't like there's anything, but at the core, when we're faced with decisions, we have got to stop. And these are awful decisions, and I hate everything about it, and I don't know what I'm going to do. But we have got to pause for a minute and ask ourselves, who should be at the table having these conversations, and who is at the table and who's missing? Because providers and people with disabilities are intertwined. Neither can survive without the other, right? There's no way to separate those two things when we talk about it. But we have got to try to separate those two things and talk to people receiving services and say, tell me more. Because I will tell you that I have talked to so many people with disabilities who would like to have different services, live in a different place, have a different work experience, whatever it is. But the reason that they don't have choice is because no one has stepped into that space to provide that service. There are no providers that do that. There is no one who can do that. There are no, right? And that's not to criticize anyone. It's to say, if we have to make decisions, maybe we should start by asking the people who receive services what they need. And I feel like that is a piece that we just don't do a great job as a legislature. And I don't think we do a good job as it as a country. We just, the civil rights mantra in the disability community is nothing about us without us. Unfortunately, a lot of times it is a lot about them without them. And the people who are speaking up for them are people who are providers, they're parents, they're aunties, they're social workers, they're wonderful people who care deeply about the people with disabilities that they're trying to support. But who's missing at the table are the people with disabilities receiving services. That's who's missing at the table. And we need to bring that back to the conversation. We need to recognize that there are great people in this space doing this work, but there are also corporations who pay their CEOs $1.3 million. We need to recognize that there are amazing CNAs and RNs and staff at our nursing homes. And there are also private equity firms who are buying them off and piecemealing them off in shares and then selling them and selling the land. We need to recognize that there are great providers who are doing everything they can to integrate people into the community. And there are also people who are advocating for higher rates for people they're supporting and then not providing the services that were included in those higher rates. We need to recognize that there are community-based providers who are providing amazing care to people in small home-like environments, like assisted living, customized living, adult foster care, while also recognizing that there are providers who are accepting people they do not have the skills to care for and then kicking them out with very little to no notice, and that there are bills circulating right now in the Minnesota House that reduce the amount of time they have to give someone before they kick them out, taking it down to 24 hours or 5 days to lose your home and all of your services. And those bills are being brought forward by people who care for people with disabilities. Those are all truths that can exist simultaneously. And we have got to recognize that and listen to the people receiving services first. All of the people. Everybody who receives complex services down to people who receive minimal services, and everyone in between, and not just people with disabilities, substance use disorder, mental health, nursing homes, assisted, like all of it. Because if we don't, we're going to listen to the loud voices in the room and I would encourage every legislator, and I know a bunch of our colleagues don't listen to this, but I'm going to say it anyway. How are the advocates getting to you? How are they engaging you? And who's paying them? And who's telling you the stories of the people receiving services? And how are you responding to those stories? Are you responding to the stories from a place of, this is our largest employer in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota? Or are you responding from, these people don't have anywhere to live? Are you responding from a place of, there's a very real workforce shortage, and that's a huge problem for providers to do things? Or are you responding from, I'm supposed to get services I'm not receiving? Because both of those things can be simultaneously true. And we have got to stop acting like they can't be and start talking about how those things are impacting the person and what are the solutions to that, not the other thing. Because what we're doing is reacting to the financial stuff and not the person stuff. And the truth of the matter is, some of that person stuff would save us money. I have talked to so many people who do not want to be in a situation that they're in, and they actually would prefer another setting that is cheaper, but they can't get it because there's no housing, right? They can't get it because they couldn't find in-home. I talked to one person the other day that said, I want to live in my own apartment, but because I need 24-hour care, it's unsafe for me, which is true. But they would rather, they have a different vision for their life. And like, to provide 24-hour care, either through a waiver or a PCA in an apartment, is significantly cheaper than communal living of a nursing home, a group home, and it doesn't matter, anywhere on the spectrum, right? But if we don't have the housing and we don't have the ability to get creative about what support care looks like, we'll never get there.
Amen to that. Thank you for that. And I think that's a good transition point to, like, let's talk about what that is, right? Let's talk about what we could do to fix this. And obviously in this hour-long podcast, we're not going to be able to solve all of this in the next 10 minutes, but let's talk very broad strokes.
You mean 30 years of 30 years of underfunding and not providing true civil rights to people with disabilities cannot be undone in one Libs on the Block podcast?
I don't think so. If it can be, let's do it. But I don't think we can, unfortunately. But let's talk about, like, how do we fix this? How can we, I should say, in the broadest of optimistic viewpoints, approach this problem from a people-centered, getting people the care that they need, and making sure that we as a society can pay for it all together? What's that path look like? Brianne, you had a good, vigorous head nod, so I'm going to throw it to you first.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned earlier on in this recording, Andy, bills cost money. Not only do they cost money to actually make and draft and all that stuff, but most bills, even if you think that they're just a policy change, a lot of them do have some sort of cost administratively to implement the change. At the very least, they have that cost. If you're able to find a policy bill that truly is just policy, and for me as a policy wonk, I love this. When you find policy that costs $0 but has a huge impact on someone's ability to access the services they need. In an environment like this where the finances are so poor, that's going to be the bread and butter of where we can make the best changes this session. Bills that help anywhere from, somebody entering the process to where they get services to down the road ensuring that they are receiving the right services, the right staffing in the right place. I'll name a couple of ideas and then kick it over to Kim. Kim and I both have bills that address, there's an assessment process that people have to go through on a regular basis, and there's federal mandates around it. There are state guidelines, but in Minnesota, that's called the Min Choices Assessment. There's a Star Tribune article about how Ramsey County, where I represent has decided to spend an extra $6 million to hire, I think it was 80 people just to catch up on MinChoice's assessments, where folks are 8+ months behind, meaning that they have been waiting to get this assessment so that they can then enter the system and try to start the services that they need. And like I said, Kim and I each have bills drafted that we're hearing this week that address that issue alone. Kim, I think yours is more from the sort of state policy level administrative side. Mine is trying to eliminate just really at its core is eliminating the frequency and trying to increase the accessibility of assessments. And so even just that, even the amount of time that it takes to assess somebody for services is so significant that we have multiple bills trying to tackle this problem. And we are just crossing our fingers that fiscal notes come back with not many dollars so we can at least make a dent in the pile of assessments preventing people from accessing services. That's one small part in the process that is actually a pretty big legislative lift when we're trying to do it. Kim, what are some other sort of bills or ideas that can help us in this financial environment, but still make the system better for folks?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do, but the ability and the willingness to do it is a different conversation, right? I really high level believe that we probably wouldn't be here if we had universal health care that included home care from the beginning, right? As it
Preach.
stands, we force people into poverty to access services, right? By the time they get to us, they have nothing in many cases. And so, that whole like actually having healthcare piece is a huge part of this, because one of the things we're seeing in the nursing homes, for example, this is a real thing that's happening, right? Is that people, so before you can go into a nursing home, you have to spend down all of your assets, but $3,000. Your house doesn't count, but the moment you move out of that house and go into the nursing home, it does, which means you have to sell it and use all of the proceeds for it to pay for your nursing home until you become desolate. And then every month, if you have more income than 100% of the federal poverty line, you have to pay that income first. Think of it like a monthly deductible that you pay to wherever your providers are before Medicaid kicks in. And if you're living in your own home, you get to keep your house while you're there, but you have to pay that monthly deductible every month for your Medicaid to kick in. So I want you to just like play that game with me for just a second. You're 75 years old, you have a stroke. You were a decent wage earner in your lifetime. And so your Social Security is like $1,800 a month, and you've got some investments. Before you can get Medicaid, you've got to spend down every single one of those investments. So let's say you do that. Now you're 79 years old or 80, and you've spent down all of your investments, and all you have left is your Social Security, which is $1,800 a month. Every month, you're going to have to spend down that $1,800 to the federal poverty line before your Medicaid can kick in your home. Okay? So how do you pay your property taxes? Oh, wait, no, we have a bill for that. We have a solution for that. You can get the senior exclusion, so you don't have to pay your property taxes. We'll take them away from you when you sell your house, so you don't have to pay that. How do you pay your electric bill? How do you buy groceries? How do you pay your heating bill? How do you put gas in your car? The answer is you do it for a while until you can't. But you don't want to move out of your home. You don't want to spend everything you've ever worked for. So you delay, and you try as hard as you can to not do it. So by the time you get to the supports, by the time you finally ask for those supports, your needs are really high. You need a lot of stuff, and it's real expensive, right? Arizona doesn't have the same caps that we do on assets if you remain in your home. Other states have figured out how to do some of that. I have had bills to do that every year. And every year people come back with a really high fiscal because more and more people will use the service, which is probably true. But also, perhaps less people would need as intensive needs. But we don't have any way to capture that, right? We don't have any way to capture those pieces. And so those are some of the things that if we had truly accessible healthcare, people would get the care they needed when they needed, and hopefully not get to the severity level that we're seeing them be at before they apply for these services. The other thing that we can and should do is really look at who's buying nursing homes, who's running organizations, how much profit is going in, and what kind of things do we need to do to make sure that we're just not taking taxpayer Medicaid welfare dollars and funneling it to corporations. We have got to figure out how to stop that. We can't undo what's been done in the past, but what can we do moving forward? Just like we passed a bill to get for-profit health insurance companies out of our public programs on the Medicaid side, we should not allow any more for-profit companies to enter our Medicaid home and community-based services side, including nursing homes. Because what we're hearing is happening when these equity firms come in is the care goes down and eventually they just close them. And they sell really fast. So there's a reason for that. Investors don't invest in things that don't make them money.
Just to put a price tag on that, because as you were saying that, I was interested what the current numbers are. It's hard to tell because of the way this industry works, but we think the nursing home industry by itself makes about $11 billion in profits every year. And that's not adding to the solution that we need.
And the nurses and the CNAs and the dietary aides and the cooks and the folks in those positions at those nursing homes are getting paid very little and working their tails off and love the people they're supporting and are doing great work. Two things can be true at the same time. The work can be worth it. The work can be rewarding. The people doing the work can be doing it for the right reasons. And corporations are figuring out a way to screw over the residents and the people providing the services. Both of those things can be true at the same time. But to come back to what I said before, we can't hold those two truths together if only one part of the truth is at the table. We can't. We can't hold them together if only one side is at the table. And that's who's missing from the table over and over and over again. And it has to stop.
That is a incredible final statement that I don't think we're going to be add to this week. And I just looked at the clock because I was not looking because I was so engaged in this conversation. And we've already gone over what we had planned, but that's wonderful. This has been an incredible, incredible conversation.
Can I add one more thing?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And I promise I'll
Go.
stop. So I want to be really clear. I've shared this before.
None of us are mad you're keeping going, Kim. So keep going.
I've shared this with you all before, and I've shared it with other people. But people with disabilities don't just get screwed in the human services budget, right? There's a bill floating around to cut metro mobility. That screws up transportation for people with disabilities. There are not protections for people with disabilities who want to use rideshare or cabs. That messes with their ability to live in the community. Vocational rehabilitation laid off dozens of people on Monday, which is the organization that helps people with disabilities get and keep jobs. Right? Section 504 is being threatened on the federal level, which impacts their ability to get reasonable accommodations at work, public accommodations, and school. Right? Special education, transportation funding is being proposed to be cut in several versions of budgets at the Minnesota House. There's all the federal stuff too, which I'm not even getting into. Like, I'm just focusing on Minnesota stuff. People with disabilities don't live exclusively in human services. People with disabilities aren't impacted by only what happens in human services, but what happens over and over and over and over again is that everything that increases their ability to live integrated lives in community is chipped at throughout different bills and different spaces and different conversations and different pieces and different pockets. Because they are not at the table. That's the problem. And it's going to continue to be the problem until we make a conscious effort to do it different and do it better.
Well said, Kim. And I think, the both of us having similar backgrounds, I mean, specifically in disability services, but in human services in general. I know that, and I've said this in committee, when I first considered election for office, it was immediately apparent to me that protecting people with disabilities and the services they receive would always be not just in my top 3, right? Like, this is my number 1. If I have to abandon all other priorities that I focus on at the legislature, I would do so just to focus on our disability community because of the reasons you're saying, right? That there aren't people at the table. I mean, folks like you and I and a couple of our other colleagues, we're it, at least for folks who are elected into the position and have either disabilities ourselves, which Kim and I are both open about having, but certainly not to the extent of the folks that we're talking about. And it's just, we do have testifiers that are able to come in every now and then. Accessibility is a problem. Workforce, again, is a problem to be able to take people into the Capitol to be able to testify. But all of that said, for me personally, and I know for Kim, like, this is our why. This is why we do this work. It is for people who cannot be at the table, people who cannot speak up, and people who 100% of the time depend on our decisions so that they can live, so that they can just go through their day the way that most of us take for granted. And so for me, seeing cuts in human services at the federal and the state level, it's not just personally devastating. It's just, if you've had a front row seat to see how cuts have devastated folks before, it's really, really difficult to get through this kind of environment. So I'm really glad, even though this topic, when we don't have money, when we have to make cuts, right, it's not a great conversation to have, but I'm really thankful, Kim, that you came on and chatted with us today, because there are ways that we can make the system better that don't cost money. And you hit the nail right on the head. It's what is the political will to do so? And I think, doesn't matter what your party is, if you are somebody who claims to stand in solidarity, be in solidarity with the disability community, you have to show it with your actions in the legislature. So, I think we're going to do the best that we can moving forward, given the situation, but I know that we're going to fight as hard as we can to make sure there's minimal impact to the people who are at the other end of these cuts.
I will just echo Brianna and thank you, Kim, for coming on and talking about that today. And before we sign off, I know some folks are going to listen to this and say, Kim Hicks, where can I hear more from her? So, Kim, where can people follow you on socials before we sign off and end the episode? Or where do you want to direct people to?
I don't even know what my social tags are. That's how bad at this I am.
Oh.
Go to Andy's pages and then follow me from there, because I think he follows me.
I'm pretty sure she's at Kim.Hicks1 on Instagram. You should follow her. Also, Kim Hicks for House is her campaign side, I'm pretty sure, on Instagram. I know that. And you should all go follow her. Very great resource. Thank you so much for coming on. This really is an incredibly important conversation. You all have heard from the New Libs and Representative Kim Hicks this week. So now go out on the block.
Bye. Hi, Christy.
Miss you. Hey, Christy, don't put any of this in. I know what you're thinking. Don't do it.
Christy Purcell.